Welcome to SaaS Backwards, a podcast that helps SaaS CMOs and CEOs to accelerate growth and enhance profitability. Our guest today is Aseem Chandra, co-founder and CEO at Immersa, a SaaS that combines product usage with CRM data, automatically finding and sending qualified, actionable leads directly to your CRM. Aseem, welcome to the podcast.
Nice to meet you again. Thanks for having me here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Likewise. And before we dig in, could you just tell people a little bit about yourself and your company?
Yeah, of course. So I started Immersa a couple of years ago, and the inspiration of that came from my prior experiences at places like Adobe and Omniture and Oracle, which is where I used to work on data problems. And what I found throughout my career is there's immense amounts of data available in companies. And I call them the data privilege, the executives that have access to dashboards and KPIs where you can see what's going on in your business. And pretty quickly, you have a sense for where the challenges are. And my personal frustration has always been around the fact that I can see what's going on in the business when I have to change something for in the way that our companies operate. That tends to be a very manual, program management driven, spreadsheet-like process. And that is the core idea or core insight that we started with and said, how do we operationalize business intelligence? How do we make it useful for everybody in the organization and drive change across the organization? So that's kind of the genesis behind Immersa, and we can talk about what we do today.
Great. So let's go into the founding story, because I think you have a somewhat unique founding story. When we did our prep session, you talked about you took some time building a dynamic with your co-founder. And I think relationships in business are more important than almost anything. So tell me a little bit about your co-founder, the relationship you had with him, and how you worked on making that into a really great dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's interesting. I think in technology, sometimes we over-rotate on the technology and we overlook the fact that the business is actually built by people, and people operate best when there's positive interactions and relationships between them. So I feel like there's a lot of value creation that happens when you build those positive relationships. And I've always experienced that in my own career. I think, so in our case, Aman, my co-founder, comes with a very strong engineering background. This is his third startup that he's working on. I've known him a long time. We've been friends a long time. We've exchanged ideas over time with each other about things that we're working on and challenged each other, but really haven't worked together until we started Immersa. So before we started Immersa, we spent a lot of time on what Aman loves to call walk and talk. And so we'd go out for a few hours on a hike or a walk, and we would just brainstorm with each other, challenge each other. And we covered everything. We covered everything from what's the product idea, what are the different ideas we were exploring, why should we go build a company together, what are our complementary skill sets, what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses in how we operate, and blind spots. And it's literally hours and hours of those conversations before putting pen to paper and say, let's build a company together, that I think goes a long way in building the trust that's necessary to build a strong company. Ken, I read somewhere that there's two reasons where companies fail most of the time, 2/3 of the time. One is companies run out of money. Second is the founders disagree with each other. And my goal was that before we even start, we should at least address one of those things right off the bat and make sure that the founders are in a place where they can always trust each other, even if we disagree with each other. And that we have a positive way to work through any disagreements. So that's really what that investment was all about. And I think it's definitely worth it for any founder considering working with other co-founders.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've done my own startups, unfortunately, 3 of which didn't go far enough. But I always had the trust with the co-founder, and it was usually external influence or running out of time and money.
Yeah.
So good for you to recognize that and take care of that on the outset. I want to talk a little bit about like the early days here. So you guys actually acted as entrepreneurs in residence, right? For those of us who don't know, could you kind of explain what that means generally, what it meant for you with the firm that brought you in, and how that contributed to your initial vision for the business.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you look at my background and experience, I've never really run a startup, let alone be at a startup, let alone run a startup.
Yeah, all big companies before this, right?
All big companies prior to that. And the earliest stage company that I worked with was Omniture, which was at the time that I joined, I think about 70 million in ARR. So still pretty scaled out, 500 people, 600 people in the company when I joined them. And so for me, it was really important to understand how startups work and what are the things that I need to unlearn in order to learn how to operate in a startup environment. Because you pick up a lot of habits, work habits from working at large companies that are very different from the work habits of working at a startup. So for me, it was really important to create that distance and that give myself some time to unlearn before I can start learning again. And from that lens, the EIR program was fantastic. Mayfield does a phenomenal job at that, in putting something together that worked for me, from making that transition from a big company to running a startup. I think the other piece I would add is my co-founder and I did this EIR program together. And it was an opportunity to not just talk about how we would work together, but also kind of test it out with each other and see how we work with each other and where our skills are complementary and what are the things we can learn from each other through that process. So that was incredibly valuable. But I think I would give a lot of credit to Mayfield, and in particular to Naveen Chadha, who's a primary investor and board member at the founding stage of the company, who took the time to meet with us regularly through a pandemic in his backyard, through lockdowns and whatnot, and give us advice as we were coming up with ideas to challenge them, to test them, to, obviously having invested in dozens and dozens of successful companies, there's a pattern to how startups evolve and where startups become successful. And having somebody on your side that has observed that pattern and can challenge you on the patterns that you're thinking about was incredibly valuable to us. So yeah, I mean, the EIR program at Mayfield, if you can get to that, it's fantastic. I think a number of venture funds run similar programs. They're not advertised. It's typically through relationships or entering the program. Unlike the VCs and the incubators, which are pretty well known, a lot of these are where if you have built relationships over the years, you can leverage these programs to make the transition from whatever you were doing previously to moving to a startup.
Can you maybe explain the idea of the Entrepreneur in Residence program, and why would a venture fund do such a thing? Yeah,
absolutely. So look, I think it's a win-win situation as long as it's the right match, and the expectations are clearly understood going into the program. So from our perspective, the value proposition is pretty obvious, right? First, create some distance and find that time to unlearn and then relearn how to run a startup. The second was, if I go out there as Aseem exploring a new idea versus I go out there as Aseem, EIR at Mayfield exploring a new idea, given the brand equity that comes from a stellar venture fund like that, there's a very different reception that we get when we reach out to people to ask questions and test our ideas and so on. So that really helped. There's a huge network around Mayfield that we were able to tap into, and things that would have taken us months to figure out, we were able to ask the experts in the field and figured it out in days. And it saved us a lot of time and a lot of paths that we just sort of explored and set aside because we felt like we were going down the wrong path. And so just sort of narrowing our focus and getting to the right sort of problem in the right market, I think was incredibly valuable from our perspective. Now, I think from Mayfield's perspective, there's obviously upside to them as well in getting to know us as entrepreneurs before we start a company. That's important, as we're going to build a company. It takes a good 7 to 10 years to build anything valuable. And so it's a long journey to be a partner at a board level. And so before we engage in that partnership, let's get to know each other a little bit better and how we work together. So that really helps, I think, from their perspective to assess us in terms of how we operate and work. I think the second piece here is I bring a lot of scale experience. My co-founder brings a lot of entrepreneurial energy, and the combination of those two can help, at least eliminate a lot of the risks that a lot of startups face in the early days in building out a new business. And so having a Mayfield-like fund, having access to entrepreneurs early in their journey and sort of ideate with them helps them shape the outcome that they're shooting for as well. So I think that, and understand the risks and understand where the opportunities are with the founding team. I think that is an important perspective that they gain where we had hundreds of hours of conversations over 6-7 months versus a single pitch meeting where you get to know the founders for the first time. And then you might have a couple of, few due diligence calls. So it's a very different level of engagement from their perspective as well.
So
the third thing I think
we're sort of back to relationships there, right? So you're really forging a relationship with these people at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that is critical because every startup's going to go through its ups and its downs, and the relationships really count for when you're going through the downs. When it's an up round and things are going well and you're hitting or beating all your metrics, then everybody's happy and there's no problem. But 9 times out of 10, that's not the case. 9 times out of 10, you're shooting for the moon, and you're barely getting off the ground because of all the mistakes that you make along the way to create a startup. And that's where it really counts. What kind of, do you have a trusting relationship with the people that you work with? And I think the third and final thing I'd add is when you engage in a partnership like this, not only does Mayfield kind of help us, not only did they help us shape the outcome in the direction we were headed and really sharpen our thinking and conviction around the problem we are solving, but they also get the first right to invest in Immersa. So they can, we still have to pitch them, we still have to convince them this is a good idea, and we still have to make sure that they feel that the entire partnership can back us up. But if they choose not to participate, then we have the option to go pitch to other companies. So that was part of the other VC funds, and that was part of the relationship that we established, or the expectations we established right from the get-go. And so I think there's opportunities, and it's kind of a win-win scenario for both parties. But I would say if you have the option to go through a process like this, it's definitely well worth it.
Did you have any other obligations to the VC, like to look in on their other portfolio companies?
A great question. So we actually had an explicit conversation around it because, obviously as they see thousands of pitches come through every year, and they are continuously sort of looking for those gems and to invest in. And so from our, we were very explicit that 90% of our time would be spent on building Immersa and testing out our ideas, and 10 to 20% of our time would be available for other work, because we wanted to stay focused on our objective of building a company and not get seduced by another startup with a great idea that Mayfield wants to back. And so we kind of limited our interactions in that way to things that were really genuinely in our domain that we could contribute towards and have some impact. But I think that's a little bit of the give and take that happens. But we went in very explicitly with the intent that we want to go build something from scratch, and we want to build a great iconic company.
And just one last question about the EIR, just to make it palpable for people. Is that firm subsidizing you guys during this residency? Are they providing any income to the entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so they do, in terms of just, we did sign a contract with them, so we are effectively an EIR associated with Mayfield. It's a nominal amount that is intended to express good faith. It's, it's 1/10 of what I would be making at a place like Adobe as a senior exec. So that's not really the motivation to do this. The motivation to do this is essentially to establish some sort of a give and take between the two of us.
Cool. I just thought it'd be good to get that surfaced a little bit. I appreciate that. So let's talk about some of that early day activity. You did a lot of potential customer interviews. Can you talk about that process and what it meant to your founding ideas?
Yeah. Look, I think we started with this broad idea that operationalizing business intelligence and making it available to everybody in the organization is the right thing to do. It's something that we personally experienced and feel passionately about as a problem to go solve, because we don't necessarily see tools that do that very well today. The question is, where do you begin? You can start in e-commerce, you can start in SaaS companies, you could start with banks, with retailers. And where's the low-hanging fruit? Where are the problems that really needed to be solved now, as opposed to 2 years or 5 years from now? And that requires a lot of conversation with different people in the industry to understand their perspective, to understand the challenges, to understand the use cases that they're trying to solve for, who are the personas that care about it the most, where are the budgets to pay for solving those problems, are those problems important enough that they want them solved today versus a few years from now? So that is where we invested heavily in reaching out to our own networks between Aman and myself, as well as reaching out through Mayfield's network, which is extensive and really helped us get in front of the right people to have those conversations. So it typically started off with, here's the thesis. We think there's an opportunity to disrupt e-commerce companies with this idea by connecting the dots between their order management system, their fulfillment system, and their shopping cart platforms, right? And now let's go test this and see if there's an actual opportunity in this domain or not. So now let's go talk to 25 people who run different e-commerce companies and get their perspective on whether they see this opportunity or not over there. And so that's the process. And so within 2 or 3 weeks, you have enough data, which we were tabulating all of our meetings and debriefing from each conversation to make sure we capture the core insight that we learned and try to test all these ideas about, is this a problem worth solving now? Is this a high enough value problem that leads to some economic activity for the startup? And so those were the types of questions, and we'll be collecting the data and then looking back and saying, okay, now do we continue down this path or pick a different domain or pick a different problem? And what do we change? And now let's go test that in that domain. So that's the iteration process that we went through for about 6-7 months with the Mayfield umbrella to get us access to the right conversation that got us started.
Yeah, I can see how having the imprimatur of the VC fund when you make those initial outreach a lot easier.
Yeah.
Than if you're from an unknown startup that has nothing in market yet.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. We talked briefly about, and you mentioned, you had this belief that operationalizing business intelligence was a sort of a founding idea. I mean, is that the why of this company? What is the why, and how did you get there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the why runs a little bit deeper. I feel like I've worked with a lot of people over the years and worked with a lot of customers, a lot of companies over the years throughout my career. And I've always been blown away by what I probably term as, it always leads to the question, like, why are we doing things this way when it's so evident that it should be done this other way? And so for me, what I realized when I asked those questions, and anybody who's worked with me in the past will tell you this about me, is that I'm constantly curious about why are we doing things a certain way. And I do believe that data can provide a very strong signal into your why. I mean, everything has multiple points of views, and you can solve a problem from multiple directions. And if you can go in to the problem in a non-biased way, which is very hard to do, then you can see the problem from all possible directions and figure out and let the data be the guide to figure out the best solution. That's the fundamental belief in how problems can be solved in new and innovative ways that are not biased by your previous experiences. And in fact, one of our core values here is that feedback is a gift. Oftentimes feedback is neither well given nor well received. It's an art in how to do that well. But I think whether it's getting feedback from someone you work with, or whether it's learning from the data that's in front of you, regardless if you approach that in a non-biased way, that you can learn a lot and solve problems in a creative way. And that's where we feel like that's the industry moving outcome that we can create as a company. If we solve the problems that we see the right way, then we empower everybody else that's using Immersa with the right data so that they can solve problems in a creative, innovative way. So that's the why of the company. I think it's also important for us, like you've heard me talk about relationships, but I do believe that it's important to lift other people as you grow, and that's not always the culture in tech in Silicon Valley. So we want to build that culture at Immersa, where we take people who are passionate about the problem and willing to commit to the problem and help them grow with the business as we grow and create a differentiated culture. So I think those are kind of the core reasons why we started. One thing I will tell you though, now 2-3 years into this journey, a lot of entrepreneurs that I've met have, in my early explorations, or founders that have not fully experienced the journey yet, there's a tendency or belief, because you only hear the success stories, that this is the path to success, both financially or fame or fortune, whatever it is that you care about. That's not why you do this. That's the absolute wrong reason to get into a startup. You get into a startup because you love the problem, and you can't wait to see what that solution is going to turn out to be, and you're committed enough to the problem that you're willing to give 10 years of your life to solving the problem. So that's the way I think about, as a founder, about why we're doing this.
Man, there's a lot to unpack there, from meaning of life to, a business proposition. I think the message, let the data be your guide, is kind of a cool thing. And it makes a lot of sense, right? If you, as an operator, right, as a business operator, a potential client, understanding that I might not see everything that's leading to an outcome, it would be great to know that. And if I'm open enough to it, to be challenged by that and to change off a status quo, right? Which is the ultimate goal of a company like Immersa, right? We want to get people off a status quo mindset.
Yeah.
So an initial target for you guys are software as a service companies, correct?
Yeah, so we uncovered a really cool insight with SaaS companies as we were interviewing folks as EIRs, which is that if you look back over the last several years, you've seen these waves of where data becomes relevant in solving problems in different departments of the company. Finance has always had the cleanest data, because without it, your CFO is going to be wearing orange jumpsuits, and that's not a good look. So that's where they first invested. And then sales came along, and Salesforce and other companies, there's a whole ecosystem of data engineers and data analysts surrounding that came about. We saw that in marketing over the past 10 years while I was at Adobe, where we essentially built up marketing clouds as a category. And what we realized is that there's a new data asset that's being created in SaaS companies that's not being utilized very well. And that's this idea of instrumenting your product to figure out how people are actually using your product. It's the best signal of what they actually believe the value is in the product. If they use it, there's value. If they don't use it, there's no value. That's the simplistic way to look at it. But that information typically stays locked in with engineering teams and product teams, because the wave of tools around Amplitude and Mixpanel and Pendo and Full Story and on, they were designed for product managers and engineers and product designers. But the signal in that data to help the go-to-market teams in customer success or sales or marketing is incredibly valuable, and it's useful for any SaaS company. So how do we unlock the value of that signal and operationalize that signal for go-to-market teams? That's the first problem that we focused on, and in particular for CS and sales organizations that help drive revenue.
So, so for customer success, I guess the idea is that we're going to be upselling or renewing more effectively, right?
Yeah, think about the different stages. How software is now sold and distributed is also changing very rapidly. So the traditional approaches of marketing-led or product-led, sales-led are now augmented with product-led approaches. And so you've got, partner-led. There's like 4 or 5 go-to-market strategies, and it's not one or the other. You may start here and end up there, or you may start here and add others. But there's a lot of complexity now in the way that software gets built and distributed, and it's different from the way it used to be with the first generation of software companies from a decade plus ago. And so to us, it's about how do we surface the right data about the customer's journey to the right organization. So from a customer success standpoint, to answer your question, they're involved with the customer anywhere from driving the initial adoption to helping them be successful in achieving value, and then retaining them, and then upselling them or cross-selling them. So there are different processes around each one of these objectives, and different companies do things different way. So how do you actually empower them with the right data at each step of the way to where they can identify which account needs what kind of attention, and then be able to direct that attention to that account? So there are tools that help you orchestrate the workflows. We're not trying to be one of those. Our focus is on the data intelligence part of it, which is answering the how and the why, which accounts to focus on and why. And then, there are tools that let you figure out how to operate in Gainsight or Salesforce or Tatango or Vitally, where a lot of the CS teams currently live, where the signal that we send helps those tools be better and helps you focus on the right accounts and helps you drive incremental value for those accounts.
So is there an integration between Immersa and those tools?
Yeah, I mean, we integrate with about 140 different databases, data warehouses, with SaaS applications where we both take data in and process it and then push data out. So underlying Immersa, there's a very robust data platform. The first year of the company, in fact, was entirely invested in building out the data platform that would take data in, ingest it from all these different sources, connect and transform that data, and then push it out, push the appropriate signal out to wherever the team's CS team or the sales team is currently operating.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, our experience and observation is that the more relevant integrations you have, the potential for growth is greater, and retention is also greater. So,
absolutely.
So good for you. So we're all familiar with the product-led growth case for this kind of instrumentation. But you'd argue that it's also relevant across the board in SaaS, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think with the product-led growth use case, the value of product data is pretty well understood for the front end of the sales process, where somebody signs up to your product, and now, depending on what activity they conduct in your product, you can assess whether or not they're likely to convert over to being a paying customer. But that's usually the first step in the journey. Beyond that, it's like, how do you create value? How do you expand the value by inviting other users into the product? How do you upsell? How do you cross-sell other products? How do you avoid churn? How do you get signals into where that churn risk is occurring before it actually happens, and avoid it? I mean, all those things require access to product usage data, and that's available. That problem is prevalent in every SaaS company. And so we view it as a solution that addresses every SaaS company, whereas the PLG use cases are important, but they solve the pre-sales part of the problem.
What does an implementation of your product entail? It's not something we talked about before, but I'm sort of curious. What is you do have a build versus buy competition, right? Because good SaaS companies have really strong engineering teams, and they've already started doing some instrumentation, even if only for themselves in engineering. So what is that scenario look like for you, and how do people make that justification?
Yeah, great question, and one that is top of mind for me, as you can imagine, as we're building the business out, Ken. So I think that's a very insightful question. The initial studies that we've done with clients, we've shown 10 to 20x ROI on the build versus buy. And let me explain to you how we think that's possible. So what we see is, depending on the stage of the company, the earliest stage companies are typically operating in spreadsheets. My CRM for the first 18 months was a spreadsheet of accounts and users and meetings. Then they kind of graduate to different tools, Salesforce, HubSpot, et cetera, from a CRM standpoint, product tools to instrument the product. And so now you start to build these point-to-point connections between different systems. The challenge with each of those approaches is spreadsheets don't scale up. We all know that. Like it gets to a certain point and then the data gets messy or out of date and so on. You cannot see a time series view of the data in a spreadsheet in any simple way. So you don't know how the metrics are changing over time. When you start to build these point-to-point connections between different SaaS applications, that works for some period of time. But the net starts to break down when you say, well, I'm scaled up enough to where I need to go from QuickBooks to NetSuite or HubSpot to Salesforce or whatever else to whatever else. Now you've invested all that data intelligence logic in the destination app where you're trying to make those choices and decisions. So the right approach is to actually use the modern data stack anchored by the likes of Snowflake and Fivetran and dbt and others. And this is where a lot of big companies invest in data engineering, data analyst resources and try to build this on their own. And it works, it's successful. But when Immersa builds the same stack in a productized way, in a repeatably deployed way, first, you get a 10 to 20x ROI just from a cost standpoint. Like not counting the potential revenue upside, I can deliver the solution to a startup for 6K, for a mid-tier company to 25K, for a later stage company to 100K. If you had to do this yourself, you're starting at 75K yourself and scaling all the way up to, we've seen implementations that take at least $1 million in 6-9 months of work to get it done. The second advantage, we deliver our first use case in 30 days. So we've sort of perfected that process of making sure that we understand your use case, we understand your data sources, we know how to connect that data, how to give you a standardized data model that we map your data into so that the metrics start coming out, relevant metrics start coming out day one. We can deliver that within 30 to 35 days. That's been our benchmark that we've been shooting for, and we get that done. The onboarding process could not be simpler. It takes about a 20-minute conversation where we can map or connect into any of your data sources, typically 2, 3, 4 different data sources in that first use case. And as long as the right person is on the call from the data team and the ops team or the sales team, we can map that data into Immersa and connect the data into Immersa with about 20 to 30-minute conversation. So that part is actually pretty straightforward. The interesting conversations happen after, once we start to make meaning out of your data. How do we activate that in your CRM application so that your teams can now actually start to do something interesting and different with that data?
That's awesome. I think the build versus buy is it's a great challenge, and if you're effective in overcoming it, the sales get easier and easier. That seems like a good foundation for the you should buy it, not build it conversation. So my last question for you, and it's my new favorite question, and you're the first guy I'm asking it to.
Okay.
If you could do anything differently, looking back on the last couple of years at Immersa, what would it be and why?
Yeah. So, it's a very insightful question because I've always tried to live my life in a way to where there are no regrets. And there's this notion of the regret minimization framework that I'm sure you've heard Bezos and other folk kind of talk about that. I would say the only thing I would have done different is I should have started this 10 years ago. And I'm not like, this is a serious response to a serious question, because I feel like, at different stages of your life and different sort of people have different risk capacity. And a startup is by definition a risky venture. But now that I'm in it, I couldn't be loving it anymore. I mean, this is the thing I should have been doing for a long time. And I'm glad that I jumped into it when I did. But I wish more people would take more risk with their careers and solve the problems that they really believe need solving. It would make for a much better place for the world that we live in. So that's my only regret. Should have started earlier.
Well, I think it's really great insight. I think people your risk tolerance and your actual capacity for taking risk are two different things. Yeah. And sometimes it's hard to differentiate those. But I also think you brought it back to something that, maybe is a good thing for would-be entrepreneurs to really think about, is the problem that you're trying to solve, something you feel passionate enough about to give up 8 to 10 years of your life to see if you can actually solve it and be successful. So yeah, I think that's a great place to land the episode. Aseem Chandra, thank you very much. If people want to learn more about your company or get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Super easy. Ken, you can find me on LinkedIn, Aseem Chandra. You're easy to find on LinkedIn. There's not a lot of us. And then Aseem@immersa.co, a simple email address. So either way, you can get in touch with me, and I would love to connect with people who are interested in data problems, whether you're interested in a sales conversation or not, setting that aside. As long as you're interested in solving problems, we're looking for people who want to engage with us in that way. That's
awesome. Thanks very much. If a listener wants to reach me at LinkedIn/in/Ken Lempit or at austinlawrence.com. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, please do so wherever podcasts are distributed. Aseem, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun. Really appreciate it.
And it was a pleasure. Thank you for hosting me today.